Dr. Wilhite.
It's still, my presentation is still open. Okay. Well, I know Margot, so what's your name?
Shelby.
What is it?
Shelby Ryder.
Shelby?
Yeah.
What's your...
My name's Cole.
Cole. Okay, Cole and Shelby and Margot. This is the smallest audience I've ever spoken to. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So Margot gave you a little bit of an introduction of some of the work that I've done historically. University of Nebraska is home to the National Drought Mitigation Center, which is again a national center that's focusing on drought issues, and that's a center that I founded at the University of Nebraska in 1995. So I stepped out of that role in 2007 and became director of the School of Natural Resources. The Drought Mitigation Center is part of the School of Natural Resources. The School of Natural Resources is very large, 75 faculty, about 90 staff and students, of course. So I've been working in this area of drought management for many years now, and there's a very large global initiative that's going on right now. I think it's being driven by a number of things. One is the large number of impacts associated with drought, which most people are not maybe familiar with. We'll talk about that a little bit. But in addition to that, it's this issue of a changing climate. So many areas of the world are going to get drier as a result of climate change. Some areas are going to get wetter. And so what's likely to happen is the frequency, severity, and duration of drought is likely to change in the future, increasing for many locations, and this is going to cause all kinds of problems, human suffering and as well as economic costs and so forth. So there's a big emphasis now on trying to move to a different form of management for drought. Hello, you're number 3, but you're not staying like that.
No, I'm just going to check to make sure everything's going okay.
Okay. So let me just go through quickly an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First, a little bit on drought itself, the drought hazard and definition. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I could give you hours of conversation about that because drought is a very complex natural hazard. Breaking what I refer to as the hydro-illogical cycle. You guys are familiar with the hydrologic cycle. The hydro-illogical cycle is something else, and it tends to, it's a cartoon type thing that I'll show you in a minute that sort of describes this issue of crisis management. We'll talk about more. Then I want to talk a little bit about the changing climate and also changes in vulnerability related to societal vulnerability to droughts and other extreme events. And then look at this issue of societal resilience. How do we build greater resilience to climate change, but in this case more specifically to drought? And in working with the United Nations organizations and the work that I've done over the years, you can really talk about that in the context of 3 important pillars to a more risk-based management approach in terms of dealing with drought. And then I'll conclude with a few comments regarding a policy framework. How do we move forward into a different paradigm for dealing with drought in the future, given the fact that impacts are increasing dramatically around the world and the frequency of these events is increasing and will continue to increase in many locations. So I'm going to give you a couple of phrases that I'll test you on later. Not really. The first one is, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. Okay. So what that is saying to you is that, you know, if things are not working correctly, if you're not really producing the end result you want, but if you just keep doing the same things, you'll keep getting that same result. Well, the way we have approached drought management in the world, in the United States and in essentially every country of the world, is to deal with it through this crisis approach, which is a very reactive approach, very little preparedness, very little mitigation, and so on associated with that. You can express this in a different way. Albert Einstein once said, you cannot solve current problems with current thinking because current problems are the result of current thinking. So that's another way of saying the same thing. Ben Nelson said this, our former senator and governor, at a conference that I organized on sustainability of the North American Great Plains quite a few years ago. He was governor at the time. Albert Einstein said it this way. And then the other phrase is who and what is at risk and why. So if you're dealing with a specific country, regardless of what country it is, and you're trying to determine what vulnerabilities exist to drought in those countries and what is the current coping capacity and how you want to improve that coping capacity, you can ask this question, well, who is at risk or what is at risk? Ecosystems, wetlands, whatever. So what is at risk? And then you ask the question, well, why is it at risk? And usually the answer to this question is poor management. It's humans don't manage the resource very efficiently. The water resource, land resource, and so forth. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So the many faces of drought. Drought occurs essentially in all climatic regions of the world. But drought in the United States looks much different than drought in Africa or in Asia. And so the characteristics of drought vary from one region to another. The physical characteristics, also the impacts vary, and so on. So, in fact, drought has these many different faces depending upon what region of the world you're talking about, what type of climatic region, and the people that live there, the institutional capacity, and all those kinds of things. So, to give you a sort of a quick 101 on drought, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about definitions. There are literally hundreds of definitions of drought. So that's one of the confusing things about drought, because drought is really depends upon who's trying to define it and what they're trying to define it for. So, definitions of hurricanes, tornadoes, and so on are based on things like wind speed and some very precise things. Drought, on the other hand, has a whole bunch of other factors that are tied up into this. So if you look at what I would consider to be a well-rounded conceptual definition of drought, there should be three important components of that. One is the issue of intensity. So we say that drought is a deficiency of precipitation from expected or normal that extends over a season or a longer period of time. Droughts can last for a few months. They can last for a few years. They can last for a decade or longer. California now is going into their fourth consecutive year of drought. There's parts of the southern Great Plains and the southwestern United States that have been in drought for 7 years. So it varies greatly, but when you look at only the intensity and the duration, this is what we would refer to as a meteorological drought. We're just looking at a deficiency of precipitation. Now, it's not only precipitation. Obviously, temperature is closely tied into the severity of drought as well, and there are other parameters that are involved in that. Maybe we'll talk about that again in a few minutes. The third component of a definition really should focus on the impacts. So it's when the deficiency of precipitation over a period of time is insufficient to meet the demands of human activities and also for the environment. And so when you start bringing in impacts of this precipitation deficiency on various sectors, that's when other definitions of drought, such as agricultural drought, which largely we're focusing on issues of soil moisture with agricultural drought, because you're looking at how the deficiency of precipitation is affecting plant growth, the development of biomass, and so on. Hydrological drought refers to the deficiencies of water, particularly surface as well as groundwater. So what's in reservoirs and streams and groundwater and so forth. Socioeconomic drought is a bit different, where you're looking more at supply and demand of different commodities. But you'll see all these different types of drought if you read the literature. So some basic facts. First of all, drought affects more people than any other natural hazard. So you hear a lot more actually about hurricanes or typhoons, about earthquakes and so on. because they can be structurally devastating and devastating in terms of loss of human life. But actually, if you include the connection between drought and famine, more people die from famine and drought than any other natural hazard. So it's a huge human health issue. So it fits in nicely to this conference. So it ranks first among all natural hazards based upon the severity, the duration, and spatial extent, as well as economic loss and so on. So again, if you think about other natural hazards, floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and so on, these are what we call quick onset natural hazards. They occur within a matter of a few days where they develop. They last a varying amount of time, but if you think of an earthquake may last for only a few seconds. Droughts can go on, as I said, for years. And not only that, but the spatial extent. The 2012 drought in the United States, in which Nebraska was devastated as well, covered 2/3 of this country. So spatial extent and duration separate drought from all other natural hazards and result in a wide range of impacts. I've underlined a couple here just associated with this conference in terms of human health and loss of human life. But it extends into agriculture and a lot of other sectors, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Implications for food security, water scarcity, political instability. One of the things you don't hear much about, you hear a lot about the war in Syria. The primary trigger for that war was an extended drought over several years and the lack of water. That is one of the things. The lack of food resources for the people in that country has led to all kinds of political instability and resulted in the war that we see in Syria that's ongoing and will continue. And then, as I said previously, the climate change is likely to shift the patterns, the duration, the incidence of drought around the world. So if you look at, for example, major drought areas that occurred in the world in 2012, you can see how they cut across so many different climatic zones, even within the United States. So as I was referring to earlier, that drought differs from region to region, not only in terms of its physical characteristics, but also the impacts that occur, which are related to the level of development of a particular area, the vulnerabilities and the coping capacity, which would refer to things like institutional capacity. So developing countries are more at risk because they don't have the institutional capacity, they don't have the well-developed economies of some of the more developed countries and so on. But the reality is that developed countries have tremendous vulnerabilities to drought as well. The 2011-2012 drought in the United States resulted in the federal government providing drought assistance in excess of $62 billion. So who pays for that? We pay for that as taxpayers. So when you look at the economic costs, the human suffering, the social costs associated with drought, we need to find a better way of managing droughts in the future. But because the characteristics of drought and institutional capacity are highly variable from one country to another, if you're going to develop some sort of a drought policy within a country, you can't just say, well, okay, here's the policy we want you to develop. Every country just take it and implement it. It has to be implemented in the context of that country. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So if we look at, this is showing the percent area of the United States in moderate to extreme drought. So the important point here is that drought's a normal part of our climate. It's occurred in the past, it's occurring today, and it will occur in the future. So the but is referring to the fact that the frequency, intensity, duration of these events is likely to increase in the future and already is in some locations. So that's a huge concern. So one of the things that the National Drought Mitigation Center does, you may have seen this map in newspapers, on the Weather Channel, and everywhere. The federal government, the White House, they all use this to sort of determine where the drought areas are in the country. So this is on the National Drought Mitigation Center's website at the University of Nebraska. But it's a joint product between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and NOAA, which is our meteorological services for the United States. So this map is produced every week. And so we watch the movement of these drought areas. So this is like a snapshot of current conditions. So this map was released on Thursday. And again, you can see California, Nevada, and up into southern Oregon. And they're into their 4th year of drought. And essentially in the month of January, they've received no snowpack. And so it's very unlikely the drought in California is going to end. And so this is going to be devastating this year for not only for people, communities, but for vegetable crops, fruit crops, nut crops, and so on, because we get so much of our produce from there. And then this area of the United States has been in drought for 7-8 years. And in 2012 and 2011, this area, particularly here, was just devastating. And part of this in the Southwest is a direct result of what's happening with regards to climate change. Because what we see in the western United States is the diminishing amount of snowpack in the winter, warmer winters, so there's less snow, there's less precipitation that falls in the form of snow. So the result of that, it changes the whole hydrology of river basins and the management of water. So it's a huge issue for the western United States. So here's the hydrogeological cycle. And so this was a cartoon this is the new version of the cartoon. But this is a cartoon that I put together years ago to sort of explain how societies deal with drought. And they deal with it through this crisis management approach. So most governments, communities, and so on don't think much about drought. And then when it starts developing, there's this increasing level of awareness that turns to concern, that turns to panic. And when it turns to panic, there's really not much you can do except try to manage a crisis. And so what I've been trying to do throughout my career here at the University of Nebraska is to look for ways to break this cycle, to insert after a drought occurs. You can't do it during a drought, but after a drought occurs, the focus should be on improved monitoring systems. It should be on finding out where your vulnerabilities are and also putting in place preparedness plans, because you know the drought's going to occur again. But if you don't do that, what tends to happen is when rainfall returns to normal, you're back into the apathy phase, and then nothing happens, and you sit there and wait for the next drought. So this is where if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you always got, comes in. And so it's incredibly important that we find another paradigm for how we deal with droughts, locally, nationally, and globally. And droughts that occur in other parts of the world have an impact on us because we, in fact, are providing a lot of free food through various kinds of aid programs and so forth. So there's a global connection here. So characteristics of crisis management. First of all, it's ineffective. It treats the symptoms of drought. So what are the symptoms? The symptoms of drought are the impacts that occur. So the impacts that occur tell you where your vulnerabilities are. And so if you analyze those impacts that have occurred historically, but particularly more recently, it tells you where your vulnerabilities are, where you need to improve management of resources. It tends to be untimely, reactive. It increases reliance on the government, and most people would prefer not to be reliant upon the government. It's poorly coordinated at a local level, at a national level, and in some cases, particularly in developing countries, at an international level, in terms of getting food into regions that are devastated by drought. And it's incredibly expensive. I gave you some example of that previously. And there's also good scientific evidence that, in fact, bailing people out of a crisis actually increases vulnerability, because it doesn't provide them any incentive to change the way they manage the resource. So if they just become dependent upon the government to do this, or upon donor organizations to come in and bail them out, there is no incentive to change the way they manage the resources. And so there's a real negative effect crisis management. So some of the incentives for changing the paradigm, I mentioned previously the spiraling impacts to reduce conflicts between water, and we're seeing this more and more throughout the world with more population and so on, that the number of sectors that depend upon water use are increasing in terms of the conflicts between those different sectors, promoting the wise stewardship of natural resources, reducing the need for government assistance, and therefore we need to invest that money into mitigation activities or activities to improve management or into other activities. Just when I think about $62 billion being spent on drought relief in the United States in 2011, 2012, I think about how much progress we could have made building greater resilience to drought if we would have taken even 1/10 of that and invested in trying to do things that were more proactive rather than reactive. The severity of droughts increasing in the future. And then final point is sometimes when I talk to policymakers in the U.S. as well as in other countries, they'll say things like, well, how much is it going to cost us to develop a preparedness plan or a national drought policy or something? And you can turn that around and say, well, but if we don't do that, what's the cost of inaction? If we just keep doing things the way we've done them in the past, we're going to continue to just throw money away because it's really not building resilience. And if droughts are going to occur in the future, and if they're going to occur with more frequency and severity in the future, we need to change the way we do things. That usually quiets them, but that's oftentimes the question. So our changing climate, you hear a lot about this. It's in the news all the time. If you listen to the State of the Union speech, President Obama spent 5 minutes talking about climate change this year. And so obviously the rise in global mean temperature can be tied very, very directly to increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well as other greenhouse gases. These greenhouse gases, if you don't understand this concept, greenhouse gases are what causes the Earth to be livable. So greenhouse gases actually trap heat. If we didn't have them, life on Earth would not exist as we know it today, maybe in some alien form. But if we increase the concentration of these greenhouse gases, which is what is happening, this increases the heat trapping capacity of planet Earth, and therefore the temperature is going to increase. People that deny that humans are a causal factor in climate change just have no comprehension of science whatsoever. It's just baffles me. So when I listen to members of Congress talk about this issue that know absolutely nothing about it, nor have they taken any steps to learn anything about it, that is just they are elected to be leaders and to move us forward and deal with issues, and they debate this because of politics, not because of science. So this is incredibly frustrating. So Margot mentioned that we did a report. The University of Nebraska initially it was requested by the legislature, and there was a political process that wasn't a very positive one that happened as a result of that. The legislature wanted us to do a study on the implications of climate change for Nebraska, but not to include human causes. So they asked me to do that report, and I said I wouldn't do it. And so I then got the university to back this, and so I was the coordinating author on this report. So there are 4 authors. So if you're interested in this report, you can go to this website. This not only includes the report, it includes the executive summary, it includes a series of discussion questions, it includes my PowerPoint presentation when I presented this on campus. It also includes the lecture, so you can actually watch the video of this. So this report now is building a lot of momentum to try and do something in Nebraska, which is a bit ironic because Nebraska is one of the most conservative states in the country. The governor doesn't believe in climate change. The previous governor didn't believe in climate change. Most of the legislature doesn't. But other groups are pushing this issue forward, so it's going to be interesting to see where that goes. Okay, So just a couple of things on climate change. This is the change in temperature that we've seen in the U.S. in the last 30 years or so. And so you can see that the largest degree of change has been along the north and then in the western United States, which explains why there's less snow accumulation in the west and so forth, because of warmer temperatures and because of the drying pattern that's occurring in that region. You can see Nebraska kind of is in the middle here. One of the big concerns is not only that was looking at an increase in temperature in general, average temperature, but one of the big concerns with climate change is the increased frequency of the number of high temperature stress days. This has a huge impact on agriculture, on water demand, and on human health. The heat wave that hit Europe in the early part of the 2000s, so it was around 2002 or 3, killed 35,000 people. And so heat stress is a big issue, particularly in urban environments. And so here you see a projection of the number of days over 100 degrees for the remainder of this century. And so what you see here is this little brown. This is the historical average number of days for the Great Plains, for example, the number of days over 100 degrees. This is the projection at a low emissions scenario. So that a low emissions scenario would assume that we're going to cut back drastically on carbon emissions into the atmosphere. And then this is a high emissions scenario, but this is what we're doing now. This is business as usual. So this is projecting that out over the next quarter following that, and then towards the end of the century. So the big regional losers where you see the greatest spike, the Southeast, the Great Plains, and the Southwestern United States. So this is, again, a huge issue. So this is the U.S. Drought Monitor map from September of 2012. So you can see the extent of the United States. At this point, we'd reached about 65% of the country that was in one of these different stages of drought. If we look at the number of days over 100 degrees in 2012, so this is between June and September 15, you can see where this heat wave, so it was a combination of lack of rainfall or very short rainfall combined with high heat. You can see where the greatest heat was associated with the central and southern plains. And I pulled out a couple of Nebraska locations, McCook and Lincoln. So what you see here, this is the average number of days over 100 degrees in McCook, about 11 days. And in 2012, they had 37 days. The projection is by the last quarter of this century, the number of days over 100 degrees in this region is going to increase by 22 to 25 days. So in other words, the 2012 drought is a picture of what we're looking at for our region by the end of this century, or the fourth quarter of this century. That's a pretty scary picture. We're also concerned about, with climate change, you can see historically what's happening to the frequency of meteorological events and hydrological events. And so these are very costly to society. So with drought management and climate change, it's not just about increasing mean temperature, but it's high temperature stress, longer growing seasons, changes in precipitation amount, distribution, intensity, reduced soil moisture, groundwater recharge. It's a whole series of things. So it's not just temperature. This reverberates throughout the entire climate hydrologic system. So if you look at the World Health Organization predicts that climate change will cause an additional 250,000 deaths worldwide between 2030 and 2050. Problems worse in developing countries. U.S. deaths are more associated with low-income families. I mean, they tend to be the most vulnerable anyway, children and elderly. And by and large, the health sector is really not focused on environmental issues. Now, Margaret, we were talking about that a bit previously. Climate change is perceived as a future problem. but it's really a problem today as well as a future problem. And so we really do need to deal with this. And there's a growing concern about the impacts of climate change on health. So just an example, disease-carrying insects in terms of the incidence of various types of diseases, an additional 2 billion people worldwide being exposed to dengue fever by 2080, increase in respiratory diseases, nutritional levels, longer allergy seasons, heat waves, droughts, floods, wildfires, water quality, high temperatures. It's a long list, and so it's something that we really do need to be concerned about. So changes in societal vulnerability. It used to be that, 50, 60 years ago, when we talked about drought, we primarily linked drought with agriculture. So agriculture, food production, and so on were the two critical sectors. But today, when we talk about drought, we talk about loss of production in the energy sector, the health sector, transportation, tourism, recreation, forest rangeland fires, municipal water, the environment, and so on. So drought now has become such a multi-sector issue affecting societies in so many different ways. So this is another expression of the hydrological cycle. The way, if you look at the cycle of disaster management, so this would apply to any natural hazard, when the disaster occurs, we go through these stages of impact assessment, response, recovery, and reconstruction. And then if we don't do anything proactively, we just sit on our hands until the next drought or the next hurricane or whatever. So crisis management, again, treats the symptoms, not the causes of the impacts that are occurring. So what we're trying to get nations to do is move towards a higher level of preparedness, so increasing coping capacity, becoming more proactive, and focusing on mitigation. And mitigation for natural hazards, we're talking about actions you take in advance to reduce the impacts of the event when it occurs. Mitigation with climate change, you're talking about reducing carbon dioxide emissions and so forth. So mitigation means a different thing with climate change versus natural hazards. Preparedness, prediction, and early warning. So what this is doing is promoting a shift from managing disasters to try and manage risk. So that's really what we're trying to do. So risk has two critical elements. One is what the exposure is to the hazard. And with climate change, that exposure is an increase in many places. But it also means the issue of vulnerability and what social factors are making us more vulnerable or less vulnerable to a particular hazard, in this case drought. And so things like population growth, shifts in population, urbanization, technology, all of these things affect our vulnerability to drought. So if we're going to reduce risk, we have to focus on changing our vulnerability, but also understanding our exposure and how our exposure is changing over time. So how do we do this? So working with the United Nations, what we've been doing is creating an initiative to try to build resilience through the development of national drought policies and preparedness plans. So it's working less and less. So one of the first actions that we did is I chaired the International Organizing Committee for what was called the High-Level Meeting on National Drought Policy. We had this in Geneva, Switzerland in June 2013. We had three primary sponsors of this within the UN system: the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, which is focusing on land degradation because of drought and human activities throughout the world, but particularly in Africa, and then the Food and Agriculture Organization. In addition to these three groups, there were about 12 to 15 other groups that collaborated with us on this. We had 87 countries that participated, and at the end of the meeting, a week-long meeting, all the countries unanimously approved a declaration that said essentially that all countries of the world needed to develop national drought policies that are based on risk reduction. getting away from this crisis management approach. And so, as a follow-on to this high-level meeting, I've been working with not just those three organizations that I mentioned previously, but the Convention on Biological Diversity and UN Water, which is a consortium of about 40 different organizations within the UN system that are focusing on water. We have been putting together and conducting a series of capacity building workshops on national drought policies in different regions of the world that are really focused on this movement from crisis to risk management. I may have to go to the keyboard. I think maybe the battery's starting to go on this thing. So we've done 5 workshops to date. The last one was in Cairo, the Near East region. So the countries in purple here would be the countries that participated in that. The countries that participate, these are invited countries. The 6th workshop's going to be this May, it looks like, and it's going to be in West Africa. We've been avoiding West Africa because of Ebola, but now all but 3 countries have been declared Ebola-free. So we're not going to invite those countries, but the other countries of the region we're going to invite. And at these meetings, we've really been trying to train the representatives from the governments as to how to go about and develop national drought policies, essentially following a model that I developed a number of years ago. Margot, I'm going to go to the keyboard because I think the battery in this thing is, and I'll wrap up. And so this concept of national drought policies, the way I see this is that the national drought policy really puts forward the principles of moving to a more risk-based management approach. And so if these are established at the national level, then what you do is at a river basin level, a state level, a community level, and so on, you develop preparedness plans that are based upon the principles of a national drought policy. So that's the way to implement the process. And so we're in a pretty good situation to do something like this in the United States. We haven't gotten there yet, but we're making progress. When I started working on this drought issue, we had 3 states in the United States that had drought plans. Now we have 47 states. So we've been making a lot of progress, and you see Nebraska, I worked with stakeholders and wrote the Nebraska plan. 2 versions of that, actually, one in the mid-'80s and then one around 2000. So the number of states that we have that have drought plans, that is, again, the mechanism for implementation of a drought policy. We haven't actually created a drought policy. There was a policy commission that made proposals to Congress, but Congress so far hasn't implemented those. President Obama has actually come close in that last November, a year ago, he created a National Drought Resilience Partnership in which he brought together all of the federal agencies to work together. So it's a step. So again, a policy should be broadly stated and promote sort of the principles of risk-based drought management. It could be part of, many countries of the world have drought risk reduction plans that are already in place, so it could be part of something like that. Also, quite a few countries have climate change adaptation plans, so it could be part of a climate change adaptation plan. There are about 10 states in the United States that actually have climate change adaptation plans as well. So that's another mechanism. It needs to be consistent across regions, population groups, consistent with goals of sustainable development, and reflect these regional differences in drought characteristics and the impacts and so forth. So these elements that I talked about in the almost the very first slide, these key elements of a preparedness plan are, first of all, an early warning system that includes extensive monitoring, risk and vulnerability and impact assessment activities, and then finally, mitigation and response. So you identify your vulnerabilities here, and then you put in place proactive measures to increase coping capacity and build a different method of responding in a more proactive way. So with these regional capacity building workshops, I was asked there was a new program that was created by the Global Water Partnership and the World Meteorological Organization. I was asked to take a 10-step planning process that I developed for state governments in the United States, which most states have used, and to convert this into a 10-step process for developing national drought policies. And so that was published last May, and so this is being distributed to all of the countries that participate in these regional capacity building workshops. So again, the idea is this 10-step process is a template. And the idea is to take the template and adapt it to your particular region. So, concluding slide, we know that the climate's changing both in terms of state and in terms of variability. Extreme events are increasing in frequency, so this is an issue in the number of sectors affected and so forth. Past drought management activities as crisis management approach is largely ineffective. And so the time is really to move to a new paradigm that focuses on risk management for drought, changes the way we do things. And this last bullet is essentially taken from this declaration that came out of this high-level meeting on national drought policy. And then the final point, again, to reemphasize, if we don't do anything, then we're going to keep repeating the mistakes that we've had in the past. And we want to really move to a different approach. So with that, Margo, I will stop, and you all stayed awake. Thank you.
Thank you.